Thank you for joining me. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me well enough. Um, so if you are watching on Twitch, please let me know if I'm quiet. I know we had some issues last time, so I want to get those sorted before we get started. Awesome. Sounds like I'm good. Okay. Um, Welcome
Just double
everyone.
checking that everyone can hear me.
Yes, there's Ellery. Um, Welcome everyone to Deep City Lectures, series number 3. This
I'm
week,
Karen.
This week we are going to be talking about the Dunny legal system. Unfortunately, we've had a little bit of a last minute change of presenters, or co-speakers, I guess, in this case. Um, Blade is unfortunately not feeling well today, so Ellery has gracefully opted to step in. So we're going to be working off of Blade's notes, um, but hopefully we can still have a good time today. Ellery, it sounds like you may need to turn up your microphone
Microphone
volume.
a little bit. Okay, hold on
Okay.
just a sec. Doo, doo, doo. Where are my settings? Here are my settings. How's that? Is that better?
Let's wait to hear.
I can't do a good like borrow screech into the mic. And,
Okay. Sounds like you're much better now. All right.
okay.
So once again, as usual, my name, hello, is former restoration engineer Gary Bedell. Um, you may know me in the community as Alumnat. And with me today, as I mentioned before, is Ellery. Um, she is going to be joining us, and we're going to be going over some notes about the Dunny legal system.
Hi, I'm Eleri, uh, former DRC liaison, former Mysterium cat herder, current unwritten cat herder, and various other herding that needs to be done for various projects. So that's me.
All right. So just to get started, I do want to preface this by saying that we don't have a huge amount of information still about the Dunning legal system, but we wanted to kind of talk about some of the stuff that we do have, some things that might not be as well known, as well as some information that we've managed to dig up from the DRC's records after they left. Um, so we've got a couple of new things and a couple of existing things to chat about. Um, so let's go ahead and dig in. Ellery, was there anything in the notes that you saw that you kind of wanted that jumped out at you that you wanted to talk about first?
Um, Not hugely, although it looks like that there was a significant overlap between religious theology and Denis law. Um, Especially looks like there are several periods where you definitely could have pointed to Denis as being a theocracy, where religious law was foremost. I'm trying to find where I found that with Visha especially. Um, Looks like a lot of the laws he enacted were very
Hmm.
religiously based. So um,
Yeah,
that was kind of an interesting.
there was seemingly very often a big overlap between religious law and common law.
Yeah.
It waxed and waned a bit, but yeah, the Dunny took their religion seriously, and they expected everyone to adhere to it. And kind of as we discussed uh, during the first lecture series, when we talked about the Medes War, um, sometimes those extreme conservative religious shifts in common law were precipitated by events that caused large rifts to form between various sects of the Dunny culture. And so the common law was used to kind of seemingly reinforce that need for singular conformity.
Yeah.
It's very different looking at Dunny because Dunny is sort of, it's both a civilization and a culture and a state, which isn't something that you get on the surface here so much. There's always people who are outside of the state who practice a certain religion, or people who are outside of a religion who live in a state. Um, and so, there's usually at least some degree of uh, flexibility or mutability in the legal system when it comes to common law. Um, But in Dunny, all of these things are sort of one and the same. The state, the people, the culture, the religion, all of it is sort of this one thing. Just because they're such a small, comparatively, group of people. I mean, you could have fit all of Dunny in New York City at its height. And so, with that small of a group, it's much more, I guess, feasible to expect a certain level of uniformity in their culture.
I would say one of the best parallels would be the Jewish people on the surface as that blend, very, very complex blend of people and culture and state and religion, to where it's not one of the other,
Hmm.
and it's very intertwined.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't seem, and we've kind of wandered off into religion already, but off into the weeds. Um,
It
there's not
happens.
really an indication that the Denis were doing a whole lot of missionary work or conversion when they did come in contact with other cultures. Um, I haven't seen anything that says, that they, oh, we found these people in this age and they don't worship Yahweh, so we need to make them worship Yahweh. So that, seems to indicate that it was very personal. It was part of their culture,
Hmm.
and not necessarily we have to make everybody else our culture.
Yeah, without diving too deeply
Yeah.
off the beaten trail here, it does seem that the Dunny were seemingly content to let outsiders be outsiders, at least in part because they, you know, whether it was through religion or some more general cultural uh, attitude, they just didn't seem to consider outsiders as um, maybe relevant or sometimes even maybe deserving of being included in Dunny culture, and so that was something that they've held very close to their own chests.
Yeah.
And there's actually, to kind of springboard off of that and back into um, some of the legal stuff. Uh, it does appear that um, uh, mainly Dunning law was comprised of large lists of do's and don'ts, um, and so kind of like I guess what you might find in some of the Old Testament books, in the Bible, lists of things that are acceptable and lists of things that aren't. Um,
Mhm.
and those things could range from uh, vows and oaths to sacrifices and other offerings um, in religious contexts, and also how to, um, you know, the ways in which you are expected to worship and understand your relationship with Yahweh, but also kind of spreading more into secular areas like uh, arts of the art of writing, um, family matters, marriage, divorce, that kind of thing, and also to kind of loop this all back around, the way that you were, or the way that quote unquote foreign blood, this outsider involvement was handled because it was frequently throughout Dunny history something of a point of contention that sometimes people would get married to someone who lived in another age who wasn't of Dunny origin. This was something that we saw come up in a big way, obviously near the fall with Tiana and Atris, but also there was a king who actually married um, an outsider, and there was a big kerfuffle over whether it was acceptable at all, or what would happen if the king had um, offspring through this relationship, and how they would potentially be able to inherit the throne. And so I'm trying to remember which king it was off the top of my head, and I cannot. Um, but there was a king who basically had to voluntarily say, okay, look, I'm in this relationship. I've married this outsider woman, um, but for the sake of Dunny, I will not um, name any children that I have through her uh, as my successor to the throne.
I think it's Lemashal.
Might be. I don't remember. I
Because I've
think.
got the note. I've got the note that in 4030 the council decided that a king had to be of pure Denis blood. Lemashal signed the decision into law the following year.
Ah, yeah, that must have been
So,
it.
so that must be him.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting to note. I mean, this is true of surface law too. Is that outside of those laws kind of happen in two ways. There's the list of do's and don'ts. This is what's acceptable in our society. This is what's not, and those often do spring from a religious source. Um, and then there's reactive laws, which are something has happened that we did not have any rules to deal with, so we need to make rules to deal with it for the next time it comes up. Um, and a lot of it looks really looks like a lot of the laws, especially um the ones about trading illicit ages and age dwellers and all of those were really reactive to when there had been conflicts with bookworlders, when
Hmm.
something had happened unexpected with bookworlders and the council was trying to react to that,
Yeah.
and go, oh God, what do we do if this comes up again?
The Airbud circumstance.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you see a lot of legislation. Like there seems to be a lot of legislation that was written up um, around the regulation of the art. Obviously, when you have three of the 18 major guilds in your society who are also in charge of the government, being the ones that are involved in creating other ages, there's going to be a lot of regulation that comes in, at the very least, to um, protect the interests of those guilds. And so uh, there is actually a lot of information on major crimes um, being uh, or legislation related to major crimes being written around the creation and trading of illicit books. If you were caught trading in them, your sentence would be permanent imprisonment on a prison age. But if you were caught creating illicit ages, your sentence would be permanent in prison in a solitary prison age. So that's even an even further uh, severity of response.
They took their nobody gets to play with the art but us very, very seriously.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's honestly not quite clear what classifies as an illicit age. Um, it would you would think that it would be anyone outside of the guild structure being caught writing or trading in these kinds of ages um, without permission. But obviously, there have been clear exceptions to the case of only writers are allowed to write because, again, Atris and later Tiana, Atris was a member of the Guild of Surveyors, and he was somehow allowed to write his own age with his wife Tiana without that being a punishable crime. And so it's not 100% clear what an illicit age really classifies as, but um, the nearest I can tell is that it's just any age that hasn't been officially uh, sanctioned by either the Guild of Writers or the Guild of Maintainers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is that, maybe illicit is, the maintainers have not checked it out to make sure it's not going to explode on anybody. Um, and and the writers have said, yes, you have permission to, get an age. I mean, there might have even been some, and this is, massively rampant speculation on my part, is that there, you could go and maybe you could go and purchase a blank book and ink from the writers, and once they sold it to you, there was a vetting process of, okay, now you have this, you write it, you bring it back to us, we say it's all good. um yeah, that's something we just don't know.
Yeah. The other thing is that, obviously, considering uh, the crimes that Agaris managed to architect for um, Viovis when he was first imprisoned, um, even if you were a writer in the Guild of Writers, there was not necessarily that sort of blanket permission to just write whatever you wanted, or do whatever you wanted with the art, in terms of working on the side, so to speak,
Mm.
because the sort of trap that Agaris concocted for Viovis was making it look like he was also, you know, either trading in or writing um, ages that were being done without the permission of the guild. And so it's a little bit of a weird gray area what exactly an illicit book constitutes, but it's very clearly not something that has been, or it's very clearly something that has not been sanctioned in some way by at least some component of the guild structure.
It could have been one of those things where, what constitutes illicit age? Any age that we say is an illicit age.
Yeah, we know it when we see it, right?
We know it when we see it, yeah, and that would have been a layer of control that, that the Guild of Writers had.
hmm But just to kind of give you a sense of how seriously they took this sort of illicit trading in other ages, it ranks up there in terms of major crimes alongside things like murder. But even you know, it seems that Dunny's society was fairly strict because even theft was considered a major crime. Um,
Definitely
but
theft of
oh yeah,
theft of books
theft
was
of
like
books.
right up there. Yeah, right up there.
Yeah. Uh,
Interestingly
Um,
enough, adultery is listed as a major crime.
yeah. So
Um,
the again, that's sort of blurring of religious and um, secular norms.
yeah, that one looks like it was Visha's fault. Visha with a V at the front. Um, who really pushed some hard religious laws, but that they may have stayed on the books for years.
hmm
Um,
Yeah, it looks like your first offense for a commission of adultery was imprisonment, and then your second offense was banishment from the family, which seems like it would go the other way to me
that seems a little backwards.
personally,
Yeah.
but whatever.
And what the heck does banishment from the family mean? I mean, what sort of punishment was that? Was it disinheritance? Was it, like you were literally not allowed to participate in the family structure anymore?
Hmm.
Um, that's a really interesting. I mean, we know that Denis took family structure very seriously, and
Yeah.
given their really low birth rate and their longevity and gestation time and all that, it makes sense. Um, in a way that fidelity within marriage would be a big deal, but that banishment from family is kind of interesting. What did that look like?
Yeah,
And
and
what sort of social stigma did that carry too?
yeah, because it when in the case of marriage, it was definitely something that like you sort of broadcast for a considerable period of time, both during and after the ceremony that you had just gotten married. It was a very serious affair. Obviously, a huge cause for celebration as well, but they took it very seriously, and there were a lot of customs that sort of reinforced how important marriage was because I think it was you took like a month off of work and you were literally bonded to your partner during that time. And, it's, I'm not sure exactly how practical that would have ended up being. But, there's certainly a lot of importance placed on this, and so I guess it makes sense in that regard for it to be considered such a serious crime if you were to break that bond.
Yeah, and you given the importance they put on oaths, you
Hmm.
know, oaths and vows, and that marriage oath within their culture was huge.
Yeah. And yeah, so there are also and unfortunately we don't actually have a compiled list. We just sort of have a bullet point style reference to it in the notes that we've managed to scrounge up from the DRC. But other major topics in terms of minor crimes, um, they uh, they included things like again the treatment of outsiders and how that related to relationships, um, marriage, writing, vows, offerings to Yavo, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it was really the day to day, this is how you're supposed to exist in our society. So those minor crimes, you could almost expect them to be like Nat said earlier, much like some of the biblical do's and don'ts.
Hmm.
Don't mix meat and milk. Don't mix fibers. Don't just here is, and those were always based in something. Um, you know, there was always a reason you said don't do this. Um,
Hmm.
um, whether it was practical in the case of early Hebrew law of you have to take your sheep to the temple to be sacrificed, was because that was easier, and then they could make sure it was done properly, and then the meat didn't spoil on the way. There was practicality behind these you know really specific ways of behaving.
Hmm.
um and I suspect a lot of the Denis ones were too, based on actual experiences. Okay, we need to come up with a rule for this now.
Yeah,
I think Erishka, it would be interesting to compare what we know about the Denis legal system to the code.
that would be
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Um. So yeah, let's see. What else do we have here? Kind of along the same lines as what we were talking about earlier with reactive laws. Um, one of the big groups of laws that we actually have um, some amount of detail on is a set of laws that were called the Losheminesh laws, um, which were kind of enacted um, again reactively in response to outsiders creating or being perceived to have created problems. Um, and so, that's when they really started criminalizing, age trading and coercing people from other ages to commit crimes. Um, but it's there's a lot of complex interactions between what the Dunny were experiencing as a culture, and especially in relation to how they dealt with people from other ages and the sorts of things that they thought were acceptable or not. And obviously, if something caused a problem, they were very, very quick to react to that and say, no, we can't do this anymore. Less so when good things would happen. They were more likely to ratchet things down and lock things down than they were to open them back up again. And so you kind of see over the course of the entirety of Dunny history that things get more and more and more restrictive over time. Even if there are some periods where things get a little bit better, they open things back up and they, for example, might let people from other ages work in their factories or with their machinery. Um, it always seems to be comparatively short-lived to the periods when they're like, no, we actually have to keep everything to ourselves and keep it all, you know, quote unquote, within the family.
Yeah. And there's totally a level of xenophobia and Denis supremacy and colonialism in that. I
Oh yeah.
mean, just, the Denis were amazingly colonialist and supremacist, in so many ways, even when they were interacting with outsiders, in a fairly reasonable way. Their belief, their core belief was that they were better,
Hmm.
and that reflects in their laws, in dealing with outsiders. Very, very rarely do we see, laws that are, and hey, we can do this cool thing with outsiders. It's always, and outsiders were a problem, and so here's the new rule about dealing with those people. So,
Yeah.
um, and that just soaks into a culture. We see it in our own culture of things being so ingrained as an ism that we don't realize that it's an ism. We don't realize that it exists. We don't realize that we do it.
Hmm.
Um, so
It's just the
you
way
most
things are, so to
it's just
speak.
the way things are, yeah. And so most Denis, you the average Denis, if you had said, you know, do you hate foreigners? Do you hate bookworlders? Would have gone, no,
Yeah, absolutely not. It's
not why.
just,
It's just, they're not like us. So when Anna shows up and is, competent and, reasonable, and, it's been, hundreds of years since they've dealt with anybody outside of their culture, um, it's probably, it was probably a heck of a culture shock.
yeah, it's one of those cases where she really kind of exposed a lot of the hidden fault lines in their society.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just kind of have my eye on the Twitch chat while we're talking here. And LWF58 says there were plenty of Dunning laws that were intended to protect outside cultures from them, not just ones intended to keep outsiders out. And that is true, but also I feel like that's still not necessarily like um, an indication that they had any sort of how do I want to put this? It's still not a guarantee that that means that they were looking kindly on others, or trying to you know look out for their best interests. It's again sort of um, a protectionist kind of thing, um, where it's like, okay, don't share this technology with book worlders because who knows what they'll do with it, or it's dangerous for them, but also it's ours, right?
there wasn't a lot of equity.
Yeah. Um, so even attempts to uh, balance the tables um, can certainly be used as another tool of colonialism. And it's something that you kind of there's an ebb and flow to it throughout the history of Dunny, and some kings, again like Lasheminish, even though he has all of these laws named after him that are very, very serious uh, punishments for doing things with people from other ages, or trading in illicit books, or coercing other people into committing a crime. He was still personally of the opinion that there wasn't anything wrong with interacting with them, but the way in which um, Dunny society and the Dunny government kind of reacted to um, the problems that they saw was to lock things down. And it's even kind of a case of even the most progressive, open-minded sort of person still has to operate within this kind of broader um, undercurrent of, I don't want to say resentment because that's not the right word, but sort of apprehension and um, othering.
Mhm. Yeah, the systemic xenophobia, the
Yeah.
rather than personal. And so much so that when we get to Anna and Hamus, I mean, guildmaster in the Guild of Linguists, so you would kind of assume that he has a sense of, you know, what makes somebody intelligent, literally thought Anna was an animal, was not prepared to even grant her, sentience and sapience at first,
Hmm.
um, until he started working with her. Um, here's somebody who looks fundamentally identical, um, you know, bipedal humanoid
Hmm.
shows up, and they, a major Denis person doesn't think that they're intelligent, doesn't think that they're an intelligent creature. Um, so, you know, the isolation that Denis had ended up in is kind of amazing by the time we get to the fall,
Yeah.
that
And
they've just bubble wrapped themselves hardcore.
yeah, and by the time we get to the fall, or at least the several decades leading up to it, it is a case of, they've been isolated from other civilizations for so long, and they've kind of calcified that xenophobia to such an extent that it's again just sort of the way things are. And even Atris has sometimes trouble kind of going against that because it's how Dunny is, and maybe it's wrong, but that's how it is. um, and we even see Hamus actually gets pulled off of um, the team that's interacting with Anna because he has this response to her that hey, this is another person just like me, and she's intelligent and she's capable, and
You
um,
should be able to communicate with her, and
right.
here, have the lexicon so we can learn how to communicate. And the council's reaction is to freak out,
Hmm.
like, oh my god, what are you doing, giving a book holder our stuff, you know, giving a and giving a surface holder, which I think, for the Denis, maybe that was even more culturally traumatic, that not only did, I mean, they're used to going to other ages and coming across other cultures and other peoples and thinking they're primitives, but they've never it really seems like they never thought about what was over their heads.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, wait, there's people? What the heck? You know.
And you can also kind of see um, the way in which they've sort of ingrained themselves to look down on others in the testimony that Anna gives. Um, and that's when somebody asks her, are all of the people who live in um, uh, Amanjira, are all of those people good men? And her response was, to or her response was to say, are all Dunny good men? And they don't take kindly to that kind of introspection, right?
Yeah, yeah. They're very, well, obviously all Denis are good Denis. I mean, because we have this code of laws and we have um, the idea that, another culture could be as morally unambiguous as they think Denis is
Hmm.
just blows their minds.
But yeah, so there's and we kind of keep gravitating towards the time near the fall where um, things have been going in a particular direction for hundreds and hundreds of years at this point. Again, as a result of the Metis War, which we talked about in the first series, uh, it was definitely um, a a pivotal moment in Dunny history when they had this sort of civil war that basically kind of shut them down as a society. Um, in terms of what they were willing to tolerate from others. And so we kind of see them, locking everything down after the Metis War, and then it kind of just stays that way for a good, what was that, 4,000 years or so, which is a
Yeah.
very, very long time to us. Um, you know, and even for the Dunny, that would have been a long time, even if they do manage to live to, an average of 350 years. That's still several generations worth of people who have lived under this much more conservative, restrictive culture.
And that's not something you would see on the surface. Early on when there wasn't, as much, world travel. Um, but even in 4,000 years, you know, even isolationist cultures on the surface were still coming in contact with other people coming in. You still had that sense of other things out in the world and other things that you existed with, even if you were, holding your borders really tightly. With Denis being a isolated cavern culture that only went out into ages and as far as we can tell, you know, in that 4,000 years made sure they were going to non-unpopulated ages or isolating from any cultures they found. It's a really unique structure and a really unique experience for a civilization to go through.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of, you on the surface there isn't really a way to only interact with the rest of the world on your terms. But the Dunny managed to construct that sort of a circumstance where, they're down here, they don't have a connection to the surface that anything can come down through. Um, you know, Practically speaking, I guess technically something could have managed to worm its way down the air shafts that ventilate the cavern, but
Yeah.
that's not like an invading force or anything like that. Um,
Yeah. And there's been speculation forever and ever that some Denis made it to the surface.
mhm.
But there was no exchange happening.
Right, and because they're down here in their own little bubble, and the only way that they can get out of it is to proactively uh, take steps to go there. it's very easy, I think, for a culture to kind of fall into itself in that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Aristotle says, isolation makes supremacist views much easier to believe
Hmm. Because you
because
don't have that exposure to kind of
yeah,
disprove what they're saying.
yeah.
So yeah, we're kind of just winding our way along here. So let me try and kind of shift us to a little bit of a different topic and talk about some of the
And
we've talked a lot about legislation
yeah,
and the way that the council dealt with law in terms of making it, but in terms of let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about enforcement and more of the judicial side of things.
yeah,
So uh, the Guild of Maintainers does seem to have been, responsible for not just, inspecting other ages, but also kind of keeping the peace within the city. Um, they were the ones who were sort of tasked with, enforcement of these laws. They're the ones who come in and confiscate Koa when they find out that Atris has taken Anna there. Um, and so we kind of have this maybe image of the maintainers just sort of sitting around and rubber stamping books, um, but that's not the extent of what they did.
they maintained the ages, but they also maintained the peace and they maintained the social structure and they maintained, the enforcement of what was supposed to be happening and social behavior.
Hmm.
So you can kind of imagine, somebody decides to have a, wild party that goes all night and somebody calls the maintainers and says, dude, my upstairs neighbors have been, you know, drinking mushroom wine all night and they have their cannon going at 11 and it's, 2 in the morning and I really want to go to bed. Can you make them shut up?
Yeah, the maintainers do seem to have kind of been um, sort of the police force of the cavern, but also they're they're also part of the government, and also they have this responsibility of maintaining and approving all of these other ages. And unfortunately, we really still don't have a lot of information on um, what constitutes a thing that would cause an age to be rejected. Um, it just seems it's not really well documented, but also just sort of from an observational standpoint, it seems like the sort of thing that they because of the way that Dunny became over the course of its history, it seems like um, you would almost get to a point where you're stopping the sorts of things that would cause an age to be rejected before they even get to that point, right?
Yeah.
There's a very doctrine sort of way of writing ages that's developed. Um, but yeah, and so the maintainers, they sort of seem to have had different divisions, I guess you could say. You have a division of the maintainers that's responsible for auditing ages and for approving them. You have the branch of the maintainers that seems to have operated the city guard, um, but it's all still under that same umbrella. And it's again kind of a weird circumstance to have them not just be on the enforcement side, but also to be part of the government that's actually creating the rules and the laws that they are then responsible for enforcing. It seems very um, different from the sort of intentional separation of powers that we have in a lot of modern democracies.
Yeah, it's when you're looking at it from the framework of what we have, here on the surface in the US and in other countries, even constitutional monarchies and places where, there's arguably democracy and there's still royalty. um there's still a, separation of powers and a set of checks and balances that we just don't really seem to see in Denis, um which, makes you wonder a little bit about how did they, if at all, prevent major conflicts of interest, or was this, I mean, it's not really, I don't know if you'd call it an oligarchy so much. I don't know what you'd call it. It's
Yeah,
really interesting.
it's weird because like when the guilds were by and large not uh, instruments of the stunning society writ large. They were definitely more geared towards the interests of the aristocracy. Um, and there are occasions that we have throughout Dunny history. Let's see, in 4721, King Damath pushed for an amendment to force the major guilds to accept a certain percentage of students um, who had passed the entrance exam but couldn't afford the cost. And so, there's kind of um, there's a price to being in the guild that is unattainable to a lot of people in Dunny. And so, there's a little bit of a separation between who is able to enter government service and who is uh, just expected to deal with it.
Yeah. A lot of times when we think of the idea of a guild, it's like, okay, here is a task or area of influence that needs management. And so there's a guild that does that. And then you can become an apprentice in that guild, or did you know responsible in that guild. But the for the Denis, it was very, it became very prestige locked, and you know based on your family standing,
Hmm.
um, and kind of, like having legacies to, Ivy League colleges. Oh well, my dad went to Harvard, and so I get to go to Harvard, and my children will go to Harvard. Um, while at the same time having that structure of, here is a thing that, like, there was a guild of caterers,
Yeah,
so
there's
they
some
handle,
weird there's some
yeah,
weird decisions in terms of who's actually leading um, faction in the government.
yeah. And did that shift? And we just haven't seen that. Like, was there a time when, the Guild of Caterers had a major seat on the council because, they did something? There was a in cavern famine, and they saved. It's just stuff we don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, we don't really know why and how a lot of these groups sort of ended up, because there's the major guilds and then there's just this whole ocean seemingly of minor guilds that kind of deal with all of the things that the major guilds don't, like education and banking and all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of a weird thing, but also I think some of it is just like maybe we don't have the best words for some of these groups because like they're called the Guild of Caterers, but they also seem to be involved in you know more than just the serving of the food. They're involved in the agriculture.
Or yeah, yeah. So maybe it's a little bit like, being, since I'm in the U.S., the Department of Agriculture is the
Hmm.
equivalent of, or, the Department of Education, or the, um, you know, those are the groups tasked with taking care of a particular facet of the civilization and a facet of the society that needed cat herding.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
So yeah,
a
I
little
mean, it does
cat
seem
herding.
like when you look at it just initially, like we're just kind of off the cuffing a lot of this, honestly. So when you kind of go, why are the Guild of Caterers a major guild? That's, we don't think of catering as a major um, social responsibility, right? But when you actually look at the breadth of what they were actually involved in, growing the food, you know, transporting it, all that
It
kind of stuff. Um,
is huge for a civilization that exists in a cave.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
that's another thing. It's just
you know,
there's
how,
so much logistical difficulty in feeding people who live in a cave.
yeah, yeah. I mean, looking at it that way, yeah, that would have been a major guild. Hi, we're responsible for making sure that none of you starve to death.
hmm
You know, and it's just somehow translated as caterer.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
a it's maybe kind of a weird translational decision that got made at some point. Um, but also, it's also just sort of interesting because as far as I know, they were a major guild from day one, and I don't know if that would be something that had transferred over from um, when they left Garterne, or if that was something that was a decision that was made when they came to the cavern and Renaref was busy laying out the structure of what he was trying to build here, and
yeah,
decided, oh, we live in a cave now. Food is going to be super important.
food is going to be super important. Yeah, how much? I mean, that could be a whole call in and of itself. How did they actually settle here?
hmm
How did they actually, make the transition from a thriving, thriving if, on the way out because, sun going nova culture to, literally 100% off colony.
Yeah, that's a big change.
Yeah. How much did they plan ahead of time? How much did they bring with them? How much did they, you know, did they have planning structure, planning meetings beforehand?
Yeah,
Um,
I might have to chat with Blade and see if this is something that we might want to do for a future episode of the series.
I think it would be neat to talk about
Just sort of the migration.
the migration, yeah. The diaspora of Brenneref and his people. Because we're so used to the end of the story
Yeah.
that we don't ever really talk about the beginning of the story.
hmm Um, so to just sort of kind of keep trying to loop us back, because we keep having our little tangents that we go off on, which is fine. That's sort of what we're here for. But just to sort of kind of loop us back to a new talking point, I guess. We kind of talked a little bit about the maintainers and how they were kind of the enforcement, but there is also still, the the actual,
Judicial branch.
judging and adjudicating of this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and from what information we have, it seems like there was a guild of legislators that ran what you might think of as the lower courts, um, appointing judges, through promotion of people into a guildmaster status, maintaining court buildings, all that kind of stuff. And they were in charge of um, all legal matters that weren't necessary to bring directly to the council. And uh, there really doesn't seem to be much beyond that, um, in terms of the judicial branch of Dunny. The legislators sort of, again, were involved in not only writing but adjudicating um, their their own laws, essentially. Um, and whatever decision was handed down from a judge, that was final. There was no appeals process to a higher court. You either had a matter that was important enough to take to the council, or you didn't. And if you didn't, then you got to go to this lower court, and whatever was decided there was what you got.
Yeah.
which again is definitely like a huge change, a huge difference from what we see here on the surface, where it's like, things are not necessarily left up to just one person's decision.
Yeah. Yeah. You could probably imagine. I mean, yeah, we're talking about, a culture that could have fit on, Manhattan Island. Um, so they didn't need necessarily quite the complexity that we see in judicial you know systems on the surface. Um, maybe they had, little, like the circuit court, you know, you know, the different neighborhoods had a, local judge they could go to for stuff. And um, the if it was a big deal, it might even been that you had to, again, rampant speculation. Maybe you had to consult with the lower court and they had to help you decide, is this big enough to take it to the full council?
Hmm.
Um, some sort of screening process so the full council wasn't constantly getting inundated with, my neighbors were playing their canon too loud at 3 a.m. Um,
And I think that's sort of something that you can at least partially adjudicate just by saying, okay, these are the types of um, either crimes or complaints or allegations that um, you know need to be brought to the council, because I mean the council was also seemingly responsible for approving people's marriages. So it's kind of a wild gamut of stuff that they were involved in.
yeah,
Um, but if you had a matter that wasn't, and again, being involved in marriages kind of again is I use it sort of offhandedly, but because of the importance of marriage and family structure in Dunny, that's still again something that almost seems like, oh well, of course the council is going to be involved in this. It's a big deal,
yeah.
because it was a big deal to the Dunny, and so uh, yeah, it's still kind of just wild that you have this two-tiered system and there doesn't really seem to be any way to move from one level to the next. Like you can't appeal to the council like you appeal to the Supreme Court or anything. There's just the court and the
Yeah,
council, and whichever one you get stuck with is the one you get stuck with, and you take that decision.
yeah. Which may be where some of that, resentment of the lower classes that Aguirre manages to rabble rouse with.
Yeah. Um,
Um,
but yeah, actually, I'm reading through some more of Blade's notes, and it looks like
Nope,
things
notes on.
were things were brought to the lower court, and the judge determined whether or not to take it to the council.
Yeah,
So that is sort of your only shot at getting to the council, is to bring your case to a judge and have them decide whether or not one of them was going to rule on it, or whether it was something that the whole council needed to decide on.
I suspect that with the council stamping, approving marriages, that was probably, heavily weighted in favor of the upper classes.
Hmm.
Like the judges probably were able to just rubber stamp the masses marriages, but when it came to the upper crust of Denis, I suspect there were dynastic concerns. I suspect there were, um, probably even consanguinity concerns. Who's related to who? Kind of like how in Iceland they have a website you can go
Oh yeah,
to put in your name and the name of the person you're interested in and find out if you're too closely related. Um, I mean, it was a small enclosed population that would actually be a consideration.
yeah,
Okay, you guys are too closely to related. We can't let you get married. Um, or this person whose dad is a high mucky muck in the ink works, wants to marry. this person, but we'd rather they marry, this person over here to cement ties between the Inkworks and
Yeah,
this
that's getting
age over.
into that's getting into political machinations that I have no idea if that
I know.
would have been something they would have dealt with, but yeah, you can kind of see how it's sort of a field that because of the way that the guilds themselves are involved in both sides of the law and also kind of their own internal concerns
Mhm.
is something that is sort of potentially ripe for abuse.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting um, book series that might be interesting for people to read that has a sort of similar structure is actually the Foreigner series by C.J. Sherrood. um, which it looks intimidating at first. There's like 21 books in the series. It's like, oh man, but they're actually what it is it's sets of trilogies. So there there's three books and that's a story arc, and then there's another three books and that's an arc, and
Hmm.
and each arc follows after the one before it. Um, but that isolated political culture where the people making the laws are the same people who are enforcing them is has got it's got a little bit of that going on in there, and that might be interesting for people to grab.
Hmm.
Let me type that into chat. I can type it into Denise chat. I'm not on Twitch right now.
That's all right. So the one other thing that we kind of have in the notes here is that if and this is again kind of a little bit of something that we discussed during the Meat is War episode is that after the king uh, abdicated, after King Kareth abdicated, and there was no longer a king, um, they set up a system of five lords in kind of in his stead seemingly, and so it's not 100% clear what would have happened before Kareth abdicated when a council vote was particularly close. Um, but we do know that after the Five Lords were um, installed as sort of the head of the council, any council vote that came within five votes, yay or nay, went to the Five Lords, and that was the only time they were involved in the voting process. And so basically, it was they adjudicated over the council and kind of seemed to have run the operation of the council's uh, day-to-day process. But in terms of actually, it's sort of like the president of the Senate, or our vice president only gets to vote when the Senate is locked at 50-50. The five lords were really only involved in making in voting or in making decisions when they would affect the outcome. And we kind of saw in the Metis War that almost immediately became a massive controversy when they effectively reversed the vote of the council on a matter um, related to age writing.
Yeah.
And created an entire civil war. And so it's sort of it's fascinating to me that they kept that structure even after the Civil War, given how massively controversial it ended up being almost right out the gate. Um, but they did keep it, and that is how it continued to operate um, all the way to the end of Dunny.
Yeah,
And
it's really interesting that they just went, this is fine. We'll keep this. And then it kind of makes you wonder what the lords were, what did the lords do outside of that? I mean, what was their political clout outside of, if, they only voted with, if the council couldn't come up with a solution.
well, it might be that they were sort of they might have been sort of considered, movers and shakers, so to speak, the
Mhm.
people who you call to influence your opponents, maybe, or to try and get them on your side, so that if it does come down to a close vote, you have some sense of guarantee that it's going to go your way. You know, there seems to be a lot of just off-screen wheeling and dealing in the Book of Tiana related to the lords and how
Mhm.
they're reacting to Atris and Tiana's relationship.
Mhm. Yeah. And the other thing, speaking of wheeling and dealing, is if we're talking about the maintainers being, the Cavern Guard, we've got to talk about the Denis Secret Police.
Oh yeah,
The
the
Denis
the
Men in Black.
the Relishon.
Not relation.
Not the Relishon, the Rele emo.
No,
That starts with an R, it's close
or
enough,
it's
right?
close enough. Yeah. But I mean they seem to not only be enforcing laws, but be like specifically outside of them and doing all the sneaky stuff. And
Yeah, they
it's like
were
the
sort
Denis
of
version of
the
the CIA.
the FBI, CIA, NSA all rolled into one,
Yeah. Yeah.
which boy howdy, and they answered directly to the king seemingly.
Yeah.
Because he was, I forget which king it was, but one of
Was it Demuth?
might have been. Um,
Demuth. I mean, no, I know Demuth used them a lot.
it might
Let's
have
see.
been his son because I know that um he had someone executed
Yeah.
or assassinated, I guess.
Yeah.
And that didn't go over well. And so uh that was right near the end of his reign, if I remember correctly. And so, he did something really like particularly egregious with the Rally Ema, and so his successor, um, I think one of the first things he did was just disband them.
Disband them. Let's see.
Let
Okay.
me see if I can check
I
my
have no.
notes.
There is something in notes.
Oh,
In 420 or 4724 DE, records point to over 10 separate groups being convicted of the I can't ever say this.
Loshemanish.
Well, Sheminish, see? Um, laws as they had come to be called. Most agreed that the Rillinia played a large role in the convictions, although there are no official records of their involvement. Regardless, each of the convicted was sentenced to solitary confinement on prison aegis. The convictions must have carried a powerful impact on the society, as the public still knew very little of the Rillium, if anything at all, and thus had no idea how so many convictions were occurring. As one writer said, there were stories of dark shadows and mysterious creatures for those carrying out such activities. It was said that the eyes of Demoth saw everything while his arms took anyone he wanted. Okay, here's a question. Here is
Hmm?
a completely rampant speculation. Were they using the Bara
Hmm. Who
to
knows?
snatch people? See?
Um, so yeah, I just kind of poodled over to the Guild of Archivists website. There's a little plug for you. Um, but the Rally Emo were disbanded at the beginning of um, King Lanaren's reign. His father, King Adesh, had um, the prophet Gish assassinated. Um,
Yeah, and that did not go over well.
it went over so well that the king was assassinated.
Yeah.
And so his son Lanaran took the throne and not only revealed the existence of the Relima and their involvement in that assassination, but also uh, basically swore to disband the group. And you know, when you shine a light on the cockroaches, they all run and scatter, and it didn't go well for a lot of the people in the Relima. Um, During that time, a lot of them had to flee. Some of them were murdered. Um,
Yeah.
and so, it took a couple hundred years, but it did finally shut down in the late 5900s, um, even though it was functionally dead for a long time before that.
Yeah. And, we totally, assume that it completely shut down. I mean, there's entirely possible that there was still some,
Yeah, who knows? I
because
mean,
because
and
sneaky is sneaky.
secret
Once you
secret
have sneak,
organizations don't don't give up their secrets very well.
no,
But yeah, it was a case where, this was a group that had been um, kind of established by King Lemishal um, as sort of a secret group within the Guild of Illusionists, which is another one of those minor guilds we were talking about, where it's like there seems to be a guild for everything, including magicians.
yeah,
And for some reason, magicians seem to be the perfect cover for a secret police society.
yeah,
Sure, we'll go with that. Um, but they were established as sort of a reaction to, again, religious and political dissent. It was kind of another case of people having vastly differing opinions on whether or not um, contact with other civilizations, other ages were um, was acceptable.
yeah,
And so you see again that you know the Dunny Society sort of um, reacting to kind of protect itself from anything that might be considered too radical.
yeah, yeah. And it it almost all of its really big laws like that are reactionary,
Hmm.
which is no, I mean, a lot of our big laws on the surface are reactionary, or are, the reason we have to take our shoes off to, fly in airplanes is reactionary,
Yeah.
and not necessarily effective. But so the Denis definitely had security theater going.
Hmm.
We're going to pay. The this upsetting thing with outsiders has happened. We're going to pass these laws that make it, make it easier for us to deal with the fact that people are upset that this bad thing happened.
And I don't think all of it was theater even. I mean, you
No.
don't set up a new branch of government that's exclusively under the control of the head of the state, um,
Yeah.
just for the sake, just for funsies,
Yeah.
and then not tell anybody.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely a case where, like, we have a lot of theatrical legislation here on the surface, but the Dunny did seem to, like, definitely be more um, meat and potatoes. We're actually going to do something, not just something, but something effective. And whether that was a good something is kind of, I think, maybe left up to interpretation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, they do, the Reliema do seem to have been kind of, you know, as an arm of the king, responsible for kind of working to maintain the status quo. And when the status quo itself is also kind of progressively sliding towards this more um, isolationist, xenophobic, reactionary culture, you kind of see that a lot of the groups that kind of get targeted um, by the Relima are either people or groups that are speaking out against the status quo. King Gish, or not King Gish, the Prophet Gish obviously is the most egregious example, but they were infiltrating um, groups for a long time to discredit attempts to cast um, Dunny and bookworlders in a similar light, right? So it's kind of there seems to have been at least some degree of some of what you see here on the surface in the United States, where sometimes the FBI just decides, well, maybe we will just infiltrate this left wing organization or this these
Yeah.
peace loving hippies and discredit them and make them look bad because they're dangerous. They may not actually be dangerous, but they appear dangerous to the people who are in charge because they're saying, hey, the people who are in charge are bad. But
Yup.
that's sort of drifting again off topic.
We had a topic?
We had a
Uh,
topic at some point.
we had a topic. We
It's
had a topic.
somewhere.
We had notes.
But yeah, so kind of generally speaking, the Dunny legal system to again try and wrap ourselves back onto that topic we supposedly had. Um, it was very concerned, it was very concerned with do's and don'ts. Very much a more conservative, almost at times theocratic society. There were times when it got especially theocratic, especially like right after the Medes War, where they basically functionally outlawed any other religion than the one endorsed by the state. Um, that does make it a little difficult to separate common and religious law when you've effectively outlawed any religious law that is contrary. But yeah, and a lot of emphasis on regulation of, and perhaps more accurately, protection of um, the art of writing, the various aspects of it, the books, the ink, the skill.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, Dunny was a culture that was very serious about oaths and family relations, and so a lot of that played a big part in their rulemaking. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about, Hillary? Because otherwise, I feel like I'm just going to drift right off topic again.
Not really. I mean, we really appreciate everybody being here. Um, the unwritten game is tomorrow, so strange things. What is our band of Misfit Denis gonna be up to tomorrow? And I'm pretty sure we're showing off some really, really cool stuff tomorrow. So
Ooh,
I encourage that. And we're gonna be starting a monthly out of cavern discussion, where we'll be talking unwritten development, unwritten games. Maybe we'll get unwritten fans. Maybe we'll get the players to talk about their characters more. Yeah,
and where
so
and where can people watch that, Ellery?
that will be on Twitch under Inkworks Productions.
Twitch.tv/Inkwork Productions.
Productions. Yeah, that's us.
All right. Um, I think that's all I've got, and if that's all that Ellery has,
Did anybody
thank
throw
you
any
all for
questions at us?
thank you all for sitting here for so long. I will open up the floor for questions. So if you have anything that you want to ask, please feel free to chime in either on Key Chat or on Twitch, and I will try and uh, see if we have an answer for you.
I'll see if anybody's talking on lore chat and CC.
Uru348 says, commentary question regarding banishment from family. Where I'm in right now, there's a family household registry, and each household has to register family members and residents. Could it be similar to that? Maybe.
Maybe.
There might have been a registry. We don't actually know if there was, that kind of a registry for people, but it seems like, if there were some kind of
Yeah.
legal enforcement to being banished from your society, from your family, and not just like disinherited or kicked out of the house. um there would almost have to be something like that, or like a restraining order placed or something like that. We don't really know, but it is interesting that they did actually have that as um a legislated consequence.
Consequence. Yeah. Yeah. dig up anything on Vata, the Ager, the story of through its ocean. I'll have to go looking. I'm not familiar with those.
Neither am
I'll
I,
go looking
actually.
now. Something Gary doesn't know. Gasp.
Yeah, I will have to do some digging on those. I am not familiar with them.
Plot, 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 plot. If you have, if anybody has topics that they are really interested in, feel free to throw them into Lore Chat on Cyan Chat. We do check there and see what people are talking about, and if we have enough material to pull together a Deep City lecture, we'll talk about it.
Yeah,
We
we're
def
always happy to chat about stuff. It's just sometimes we don't know exactly what other folks are interested in hearing about, and it might just be a case of, we don't have the information to talk about it, but you're always more than welcome to throw out a suggestion. And yeah, if we have the material, we will happily do it.
I'm totally on board with that theory about the yeah, I can word really having access to the borrow
Hmm,
for snap people in the dark. That I like that idea. I'm totally gonna go with that. Yeah, I like the idea of the migration to cavern topic.
I might have
Uh,
to write that down as the one we do next because I also really like that.
yeah,
And I think we have some stuff that's maybe not directly talking about the migration itself, but certainly a lot of information we seem to have about them getting established here once they did
yeah.
move.
Once they
Um,
got here.
so I think that might actually be a good one to chat about.
Yeah, and I know at some point in the future, we want to do some discussion about Denis architecture, because there's the lady who just did her thesis on archaeology and architecture and stuff like that in Denis, and so there's some really cool stuff we could talk about, and I think especially with the cavern kind of coming back alive and being able to bring some of this stuff to people who haven't heard all of the rampant speculation and the lore digging and that people have been doing for 20 years.
hmm Um,
It's fun to
I
do.
I would probably be more than willing to talk your ear off for 6 hours about Dunny architecture. It's very fascinating, and I find it a really interesting subject. The only reason I haven't leapt onto it as a topic for Deep City lectures is that it seems like it's something that would require more visual aid.
Yeah,
So I would have to kind of maybe think about how to do that in a strictly audio format. I know we're standing here in the neighborhood, but it's apparently shockingly difficult to get a slide projector down here. Um, so we'll have to think about that for a while, and
yeah,
see if there's a way to do that that doesn't require um, trying to describe architectural detail to people who maybe don't have an architectural background, and weed out all that jargon and make it still intelligible.
real intelligible. Yeah, and maybe hunt down Laxman and see if we can get a get a. Can we get a laptop and a camera down here, please, dude? Really?
Yeah.
He's got to be somewhere.
But yeah, so we have a question from LWF58 in the Twitch chat, asking if there was proof that the maintainers were cavern law enforcement. That's the information that we have on the Guild of Archivists, and I unfortunately some of the stuff in the Guild of Archivists isn't uh, still super well sourced yet, so I will have to actually dig for where that information came from originally. But that is sort of where that's coming from for me. I use the guild. I mean, I use the Guild of Archivists as my own reference because otherwise I would never be able to keep it all in my head anyway. Um, and so it's I'm not just the a user. I'm the owner. Um, but if anybody does have a source for that, please feel free to drop it on the Guild of Archivists page for the Guild of Maintainers. Otherwise, I will have to try and dig around for that. But that's where my recollection is coming from.
So, yay! Thank you, everybody, for being here and hanging
Yes.
out with us and listening to us ramble. I'm sure JD Barnes would have been much better at some of this than I wander. I tangent. He's
Yeah,
much better at lectures. I tangent.
we will have to try and like I said, come up with something that we can do for Dunny architecture to make that a topic that will work well. Um, and I think we will be doing migration to the cavern is our next one. We'll see if we can talk to JD and figure out what time that would work for him and I. And yeah, thank you all for coming to this one. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.